A perfect illusion. The morning light poured into the kitchen, painting golden streaks across the floor as I sipped my coffee. The familiar hum of family life filled the air, dishes clinking, the television murmuring in the living room, and the sound of our youngest, Lily, laughing at something her brother said. For a moment, I let myself sink into the illusion of normalcy, into the world I'd built with Sarah, my wife of 15 years. To any outsider, we were the picture of stability, a loving couple raising 3 incredible kids in a comfortable suburban home. But illusions, no matter how perfect, have a way of cracking, and mine was about to shatter. The first suspicion. It began innocuously, as these things often do. Sarah had been spending more time on her phone lately. Late-night texts, an unexplained smile at the screen, and a newfound guardedness when I walked into the room. At first, I brushed it off. Everyone deserves their privacy, I told myself. She's probably chatting with friends or caught up in some work drama, but the gnawing feeling in my gut refused to be ignored. One night after she'd gone to bed, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I glanced at the screen and saw a notification, a message from someone named M. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the name that bothered me. It was the familiarity of it. M. A name that Sarah had mentioned casually over the years. A colleague from work. A friend. I told myself I was overthinking it, but that small, seemingly insignificant moment planted a seed of doubt. The unearthing of secrets. Weeks passed, and the unease grew. I began to notice patterns I hadn't before. Sarah working late more often, unexplained absences on weekends, and a certain detachment in her interactions with me. I needed to know the truth. One evening after the kids were in bed, I sat at my desk, staring at the laptop in front of me. My hands hovered over the keyboard, my mind warring with itself. This isn't you, Alex. Snooping, checking up on your wife? Have you really sunk this low? But the doubt wouldn't let me rest. I logged into our shared phone account, heart pounding in my chest. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Hundreds of text messages exchanged with M. And then there were the call logs. Late-night conversations that stretched into the early hours of the morning. My stomach churned. Still, I wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. I wanted to believe that the woman I'd built a life with wouldn't betray me like this, the evidence that broke me. It wasn't until I found the photos that I could no longer cling to denial. A week later, while Sarah was out running errands, I searched the house, driven by an instinct I couldn't suppress. I found an old USB drive tucked into the back of her nightstand drawer, hidden beneath a pile of receipts and random knickknacks. When I plugged it into my laptop, my world collapsed. Photos of Sarah and M together, spanning the last decade. Pictures of them at company events, on trips I didn't know she'd taken, and even in places I recognized from our own family vacations. 10 years. That was how long she'd been lying to me. How long she'd been sharing herself with another man while coming home to our bed, our children, our life. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The confrontation. That night, I confronted Sarah. The kids were asleep, their laughter replaced by the quiet hum of the house. I stood in the living room, the USB drive in my hand, my heart hammering in my chest. Sarah, we need to talk. She looked up from her book, her face calm and composed. But when she saw the drive in my hand, her expression changed. First, confusion, then something resembling fear. "What's that?" she asked, her voice tight. "You tell me," I replied, tossing the drive onto the coffee table. She hesitated, her gaze flickering between me and the drive. "Alex, don't lie to me, Sarah. Not anymore." Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment she looked like a different person, a stranger wearing my wife's face. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. "It wasn't supposed to go this far." 10 years, I said, my voice shaking. "You've been cheating on me for 10 years, Sarah. Do you have any idea what you've done? To me? To our family?" The fallout. She tried to explain, to justify her actions, but her words felt hollow. She spoke of loneliness, of feeling unappreciated, of wanting something more. But all I could think about were the sacrifices I'd made for her. For us. The late nights at work to provide for our family. The dreams I'd set aside to support. Hers. The moments I'd missed with our kids because I thought I was building a future for all of us. And all the while, she'd been building a life with someone else. The aftermath. Over the following weeks, we began the process of separation. It was messy and painful, but I knew it was the only path forward. A wound that won't close. The weeks following my discovery were a blur of anger, confusion, and heartbreak. Nights turned into sleepless marathons of questions I couldn't answer, thoughts I couldn't escape. I wanted to scream, cry, break. Something, anything to release the storm inside me. But I didn't. Instead, I wore my mask. For the kids, I plastered on a forced smile, went through the motions, and tried to shield them from the growing rift between their mother and me. They didn't understand why things felt off. Why Mom and Dad's laughter had disappeared, replaced by sharp silences and tension thick enough to cut. The kids deserved better. And Sarah? Sarah didn't deserve the luxury of my silence anymore. The confrontation that lingered. It was a quiet evening when the dam finally broke. The kids were asleep, their soft breathing echoing faintly from upstairs. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the evidence I'd gathered. The photos, the texts, the call logs. My heart felt like it was being crushed under the weight of it all. When Sarah walked in, she froze. She must have seen the storm brewing in my expression, the tremble in my clenched fists. "Alex," she began, her voice cautious. "What's wrong?" "What's wrong?" I repeated, my tone cold, unfamiliar even to myself. "You really want to play that game, Sarah?" She hesitated, then lowered herself into the chair across from me. The air between us felt like a chasm. "Alex, Stop." I slid the USB drive across the table. Her eyes widened when she saw it. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Does it matter?" I leaned forward, my gaze boring into hers. "What matters is that I know. About him. About the 10 years you spent lying to me, sneaking around, breaking every promise we ever made to each other." Her face paled, her hands trembling as she reached for the drive. "Alex, please, I can explain." "Explain?" I laughed bitterly. "Go ahead, Sarah. Explain to me how you managed to look me in the eye every single day, knowing you were betraying me. Explain how you kissed me goodnight while texting him under the covers. Explain how you threw away everything we built for—" "What? Some thrill? Some escape?" Her side of the story. Tears streamed down her face, but they didn't move me. Not this time. "I didn't plan for it to happen," she said, her voice breaking. "It started as just someone to talk to. Someone who listened, who made me feel seen." Seen? The word tasted bitter on my tongue. "I was here, Sarah. I was always here. Did you ever stop to think about what I was feeling? Or was I just part of the background to you?" She shook her head, sobbing. "It wasn't like that. I was lonely, Alex. You were always working, always distracted. I felt invisible." I clenched my jaw, the weight of her words pressing down on me. "So instead of talking to me, instead of telling me how you felt, you ran to him. You chose to destroy us instead of trying to fix what we had." The breaking point. Her silence was deafening. She had no defense, no justification that could make her actions anything less than what they were, a betrayal of everything we'd built together. I stood, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I hope it was worth it, Sarah," I said, my voice cold and final. "Because whatever you were looking for with him, it cost you me." As I walked away, I didn't look. Back, I couldn't. The weight of the aftermath. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. The house felt like a battleground, each corner haunted by memories that now felt tainted. I started sleeping in the guest room, unable to bear the thought of sharing a bed with her. We tried to keep things normal for the kids, but they weren't stupid. They saw the cracks, the unspoken pain hanging in the air. One night, our oldest, Emma, came to me. She was only 13, but the wisdom in her eyes broke my heart. "Dad," she said softly, sitting beside me on the couch, "are you and Mom okay?" I froze, unsure how to respond. How do you explain betrayal to a child? How do you tell them that the foundation of their world is crumbling beneath them? "We're figuring things out," I said finally, my voice thick with emotion. "But no matter what happens, Emma, I need you to remember that we love you. That will never change." She nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "I love you too, Dad." The path forward. The decision to separate wasn't an easy one, but it was inevitable. Trust once broken is almost impossible to rebuild. As I packed my things and prepared to leave the home we'd built together, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for the life I was leaving behind, and relief at the thought of a fresh start. Sarah tried to apologize, to convince me to stay. But her words rang hollow. The damage was done, and there was no going back. Now, as I stand at the threshold of a new chapter, I feel a flicker of hope. A new chapter for Alexit was strange, stepping out of the house I had once called home, knowing I'd never return to it the same way. The quiet suburban street felt foreign, the air heavier than usual. The kids waved from the front porch as I loaded the last of my boxes into the trunk. Sarah stood behind them, her face etched with an expression I couldn't quite place, guilt, sadness, or maybe regret. "Take care of them," I said to her, my voice steadier than I expected. She nodded silently, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, as if trying to hold herself together. As I drove away, I didn't look back. It wasn't out of spite. I simply couldn't bear to see their faces in the rearview mirror. Life after the storm moving into the small apartment downtown was an adjustment. It wasn't much, a modest one-bedroom with peeling wallpaper and a view of a busy intersection. But it was mine. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of autonomy, of ownership over my life. The first few weeks were hard. Nights were the worst, the silence deafening without the kids' laughter or the familiar hum of family life. I found myself reaching for my phone, almost texting Sarah out of habit, before remembering the chasm that now separated us. But with time, the pain dulled, replaced by something quieter. Clarity. Seeking the truth. I couldn't just leave the past behind without understanding it. Why had Sarah done what she did? What had driven her to seek solace in someone else instead of coming to me? Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her for coffee one rainy afternoon. She arrived late, her hair damp and her expression tentative. "Thank you for coming," she said softly as she sat across from me. I nodded, my fingers wrapping around the warmth of my cup. "I need to understand, Sarah, for the kids' sake, for my sake." She sighed, her shoulders slumping under the weight of the conversation. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Alex. I need you to know that it wasn't about you, not really." I frowned, the words cutting deeper than she probably intended. "Then what was it about?" "It was about me," she admitted, her voice trembling. "About feeling trapped, like I'd lost who I was outside of being your wife and their mother. I felt invisible, and I didn't know how to tell you that without sounding..." Ungrateful. I shook my head, frustration bubbling to the surface. You had a choice, Sarah. You could have talked to me, but instead you chose to lie. For 10 years. I know, she said, tears welling up in her eyes, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But Alex, I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. Even when I was with him, it was never the same. It was never real. Closure, or a new beginning. Her words lingered long after our conversation ended. They didn't absolve her, but they added a layer of complexity to my understanding of her actions. I spent the next few months focusing on myself, rebuilding my life brick by brick. I started therapy, where I unpacked years of suppressed emotions and unspoken fears. I reconnected with old friends, took up running, and even enrolled in a photography class, something I'd always wanted to try but never had the time for. As for Sarah, our interactions became cordial, centered solely around the kids. There were moments when the pain resurfaced, when the sight of her at a school event or family gathering felt like a dagger twisting in my chest. But with each passing day, the wound healed a little more. The next chapter one evening, as I sorted through old photos, Emma walked into my apartment, holding a drawing she'd made in art class. "Dad, look," she said, her face beaming with pride. I looked at the picture, a vibrant, chaotic mix of colors that somehow came together to form a sunset. "It's beautiful," I said, pulling her into a hug. "Do you think it looks like a new beginning?" She asked, her voice filled with innocent curiosity. I smiled, a lump forming in my throat. "Yeah, Emma, I think it does." As she ran off to show her siblings, I leaned back and looked out the window, the city lights twinkling like stars. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt something new blooming inside me. Hope. Sarah's reflection in the months after Alex left, the house grew quieter. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the absence of warmth. The kind of warmth that comes from shared laughter, stolen glances, and the unspoken comfort of knowing someone is there for you. The kids tried to keep the atmosphere lively, their chatter filling the gaps where Alex's presence used to be. But even they felt the shift. I could see it in the way Ethan avoided looking at me when he asked about his dad, or how Emma would talk about spending time at Alex's new apartment with a mix of excitement and guilt. I spent a lot of nights sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair where Alex used to sit. The weight of what I'd done settled on me like a heavy cloak, suffocating and inescapable. Looking in the mirror. One evening, as I tucked the kids into bed, Emma held onto my hand a little longer than usual. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice small, "are you sad?" Her question hit me harder than I expected. I knelt beside her bed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Why do you ask that, sweetheart?" "Because you look sad," she said simply, her innocent eyes searching mine. I forced a smile, though it felt like my face might crack under the strain. "Sometimes grown-ups feel sad, Emma, but it doesn't mean we don't love you or Ethan or Maddie. You three make me very happy." She seemed to accept my answer, but as I closed her bedroom door, I realized she was right. I was sad, cripplingly so, and for the first time, I couldn't blame anyone but myself. Confronting the past, the guilt was a constant companion, but so was the question I kept avoiding. Why had I done it? It was easy to tell myself it had been a moment of weakness, that I'd felt lost and unappreciated. But as I delved deeper into my own thoughts, I realized it wasn't that simple. I had been scared of losing myself, of becoming irrelevant, of being stuck in a life that felt too predictable. But instead of confronting those fears, I had run from them. I had sought validation in someone else, thinking it would fill the void inside me. It hadn't. If anything, It had made the void larger. Taking responsibility one day, I made an appointment with a therapist. I had never been the type to seek help. I'd always prided myself on being independent, on handling things on my own. But this was bigger than me, and I owed it to my kids, and to Alex, to do the work. In therapy, I began to unravel the threads of my choices, examining the patterns that had led me to betray the person who had once been my best friend. It was painful, facing the truth of my own flaws. But it was also liberating, like shedding a skin that no longer fit. Reaching out a few months after Alex and I had our coffee shop conversation, I felt ready to try again. Not to win him back, but to show him that I was trying to be better. Wrote him a letter. Alex, I know words can't undo the hurt I've caused, but I need you to know how deeply sorry I am, not just for what I did, but for the ways I failed you as a partner. You deserved better than what I gave you, and I'll carry that regret with me forever. I've been working on myself, trying to understand the choices I made and how to be a better person, not just for the kids, but for myself. I don't expect your forgiveness, and I won't ask for it. But I hope that one day when you think of me, it won't only be with anger. I hope you'll see that I'm trying to change. Thank you for being an amazing father to our children. They are so lucky to have you, and I am grateful every day for the way you love them. Sincerely, Sarah, moving forward. I didn't know if Alex would respond to the letter. Part of me didn't expect him to. But I felt lighter after sending it, as if I had taken a step toward letting go of the shame that had been weighing me down. Over time, I began to rebuild my life, focusing on being the best mother I could be. I poured my energy into my work, started volunteering at the kids' school, and reconnected with friends I had drifted away from. There were moments when the loneliness was overwhelming, when I missed the life we had built together. But I knew I couldn't go back. Not to who I was, and not to the person Alex had every right to walk away from. All I could do was move forward, one step at a time, and hope that one day I could look in the mirror and be proud of the person looking back. Alex's reaction to the letter. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 2 days before I found the courage to open it. I recognized Sarah's handwriting immediately, a little slanted with rounded edges, just like how she used to write me. Love notes back in college. There was a time when seeing her penmanship would have filled me with warmth. Now it just made my chest ache. I finally opened it late one night after the kids had gone to bed. I was sitting at the dining table, the same table where we used to eat dinner as a family, the space now emptier than it had ever felt. Her words hit me like a wave. I read the letter once, then again. Each line was like a thread pulling at the tapestry of my emotions, unraveling the anger, the bitterness, and, unexpectedly, the grief. I wanted to stay angry. Anger was easier. Anger made sense. But as I sat there, staring at the page, I realized that anger wasn't the only thing I was feeling. The weight of forgiveness. Her letter didn't erase the betrayal. It didn't undo the nights I spent questioning every moment of our marriage, wondering what was real and what wasn't. But it was honest. It was raw. And most importantly, it felt genuine. I could see that she was trying, that she was taking responsibility in a way she hadn't before. Do I forgive her? The question lingered, heavy and unresolved. Forgiveness felt like a mountain I wasn't ready to climb. But as I sat there, I realized I didn't have to answer that question right now. Forgiveness didn't have to come all at once. It could come in pieces, if it came at all. What I did know was that I didn't hate her anymore. A quiet moment. The next morning, I found myself looking at the kids differently. Emma had her mother's, eyes wide and expressive, and Ethan had her smile, the kind that could light up a room. Maddie, our youngest, was still too little to fully understand what had happened between us, but she clung to me like a lifeline whenever she was home. They loved their mom, and despite everything, I couldn't take that from them. That evening, as I dropped the kids off at Sarah's house, I saw her standing in the doorway. She looked different, not physically, but there was a quietness about her, a humility that hadn't been there before. "Hi," she said softly, her voice almost tentative. "Hi," I replied, my tone neutral but not unkind. For a moment, we just stood there, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. I thought about the letter, about the effort she was making to be better, and though I didn't know what the future held, I decided to offer her a small step forward. "Thanks for the letter," I said. Her eyes widened slightly and she nodded. "You're welcome." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Moving towards healing in. The weeks that followed, things began to shift. Slowly, carefully. We started communicating more, not about us, but about the kids. We worked together on schedules, attended school events without the tension that had once filled the air, and even managed to have a civil conversation about Ethan's soccer practice. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't a return to what we once had, but it was healing in its own way. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. The letter's weight. That night, after Sarah handed me the envelope, I couldn't bring myself to open it. I tossed it onto the passenger seat of my car, where it sat for 2 days, mocking me with its quiet presence. It was the third night when curiosity, or perhaps the smallest flicker of hope, got the better of me. I sat at the edge of my bed, the kids asleep down the hall, and finally tore the envelope open. Her words were long and winding, an attempt to peel back layers of the past I had tried to bury. She wrote about regret, about the shame she felt for betraying me, and about the pain of living with her choices. But it was the part about the kids that cut the deepest. "I see them, Alex. I see how they look at you. You're their world, and I've been the one to disrupt it. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know I'm trying to be better. For them, if not for us." Her words struck like a hammer against a wall I thought was indestructible. Lingering anguish, I wanted to crumple the letter and throw it away. Part of me wanted to walk into the kids' rooms, look at their sleeping faces, and remind myself why forgiveness wasn't an option. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there for what felt like hours, the letter crumpled in my hands, my chest tight, with the weight of emotions I didn't want to feel. I thought about the first time we met, how her laughter had been the soundtrack to some of my happiest moments. I thought about the years we spent building a life together, the children we brought into this world. Then I thought about the lies, the deception, the nights I spent wondering if I wasn't enough. Was I even capable of forgiving her? A fragile conversation. The next time I dropped the kids off at Sarah's house, I lingered in the driveway for a moment longer than usual. She stepped out onto the porch, her expression cautious but not unkind. "Thanks for taking them to the park," she said softly, her hands clasped in front of her. I nodded, my jaw tight. "It's what they deserve." Her eyes flicked down, guilt evident in the slump of her shoulders. "I meant what I said in the letter, Alex. I'm not asking for anything from you. I needed to tell you." I could feel my pulse in my ears. The words I wanted to say stuck in my throat. Instead, I simply nodded again. "I got it." Her gaze lingered on me for a moment longer, as if searching for something in my face. Then she nodded and turned back toward the house. Internal turmoil. That night I couldn't sleep. Her words replayed, in my mind like a broken record. I hated that a part of me still cared. I hated that she could still evoke emotions I thought I had buried. But most of all, I hated the doubt that was creeping in. The small, insistent voice whispering that maybe, just maybe, forgiveness wasn't about letting her off the hook. Maybe it was about letting myself move on. I didn't know if I could ever forgive Sarah for what she did, but I realized I didn't have to decide right now. What mattered was the kids, What mattered was making sure they felt loved and safe, and maybe, just maybe, that could be enough, for now. The unexpected conversation. The days following Sarah's letter felt like walking through a fog, everything muted, my thoughts distant. I had shoved the letter into a drawer after reading it, determined not to let it linger in my mind. But it did, sneaking into my thoughts at the most unexpected times. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, while the kids played outside, I found myself staring at the drawer where I'd hidden the letter. My hand reached for it before I could stop myself, the crumpled paper unfolding in my hands as if it carried its own weight. Her words were raw and unfiltered, painting a picture of regret that felt almost too heavy to bear. Yet buried within the apologies and admissions of guilt was something I hadn't expected. An acknowledgement of the pain she had caused me, of the depth of the betrayal she had inflicted. I know I shattered something that might never be whole. Again, Alex, I live with that every day, but I also know you deserved better, not just from me, but from life. You're the best father our kids could ask for, and the best man I've ever known. I'm sorry I didn't honor that when I had the chance. I clenched the letter tightly, my chest tightening as her words sank in. Was this genuine? Could someone, who had caused so much hurt, truly understand the depth of their actions? Seeking closure. A week later, I found myself sitting across from Sarah at a small cafe. It had been years since we'd shared a space like this, and the silence between us was thick with unspoken words. She had asked to meet, and against my better judgment, I had agreed, if only to finally put everything on the table. Her appearance startled me. She looked older, more tired than I remembered. There was a weariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, as if the weight of her choices had etched themselves into her very being. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice tentative. I nodded, my hands wrapped around the coffee cup in front of me. "You said you wanted to talk, so talk." She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her own cup. "I don't know where to start. There's so much I need to say, but I'm not sure it'll mean anything to you." "Try me," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. "I hurt you in ways I can never take back. I know that. And I'm not here to ask for forgiveness, Alex. I'm here because I need you to know that I've changed. For the kids, for myself, for you, even if it's too late." A confession and a reckoning. Her words spilled out like a dam breaking, how she had lost herself in the chaos of motherhood, how the affair had been less about me and more about her own insecurities and failures. She confessed to moments of doubt and shame that had haunted her long before our marriage began to crack. "I was selfish," she admitted, tears pooling in her eyes. "I took you for granted. I thought I needed something more. But what I needed was to face my own demons, and instead I destroyed everything we had." Her voice cracked, and for a moment I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite identify. Sympathy? Pity? Or perhaps the faintest trace of the love I had buried so deeply. I leaned back in my chair, my jaw tight. "You didn't just hurt me, Sarah. You broke me. You made me question everything. About us, about myself. And now you're sitting here telling me you've changed? What am I supposed to do with that?" She nodded, wiping at her eyes. "You don't have to do anything. I just needed you to know. That's all. I needed to say it out loud, even if it doesn't change a thing. The path forward." I drove home that evening. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Her words had stirred something in me, but they hadn't erased the pain. They hadn't rewritten the years of betrayal, but they had given me something I hadn't realized I needed: an acknowledgement. For the first time in years, I felt a small sliver of peace. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, and maybe not ever, but it was a step toward understanding. a step toward letting go of the anger that had weighed me down for so long. When I walked into the house, the kids ran to greet me, their laughter filling the air. And in that moment, I realized what truly mattered. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about building a future, one where their smiles would never fade, no matter what had happened between their mother and me. The shattered reflection days turned into nights, and I found myself pacing the living room like a caged animal, Sarah's words echoing in my mind. I've changed. What did that even mean? Could a decade of betrayal be undone by a mere confession? Of regret? My chest tightened as memories came rushing back. Moments when I'd trusted her implicitly, when I'd believed we were partners in everything. Her laugh as we shared inside jokes, the way her hand fit so naturally in mine, the nights we'd stayed up late dreaming about a future together. And all the while, she had been leading a double life. I stared at my reflection in the darkened window, my own face looking back at me like a stranger. I didn't recognize the man I had become. Guarded, bitter, hollowed out by years of doubt and pain. And yet there was something else, a flicker of relief. As if her admission had pulled a thorn from my side, one I hadn't even realized, was still there, confronting the evidence. I couldn't sleep that night. My thoughts were too loud, and the house felt too quiet. I found myself in the attic, rifling through old boxes. Among them was the file I had compiled all those years ago, evidence of Sarah's infidelity. I hesitated before opening it, my hands trembling. I hadn't looked at these documents since the divorce. Photos, emails, receipts. It was all there, a meticulous record of her betrayal. As I leafed through the pages, I felt a strange detachment, like I was reading someone else's story. The anger that had once burned so fiercely had dimmed, replaced by a cold, aching sadness. One photo in particular caught my eye. Sarah with him, her hand resting on his arm, her smile radiant. It was the kind of smile she used to reserve for me. I clenched my jaw, my fingers tightening around the photo. She doesn't get to rewrite history, I thought bitterly. She doesn't get to pretend this didn't happen. The unexpected decision. The next morning I sat down at the kitchen table, with a cup of coffee and the file. I stared at it for a long time, debating what to do. Should I confront her with this again? Demand answers to questions that had haunted me for years, or should I let it go? The kids came bounding into the kitchen, their laughter breaking through my thoughts. I looked at their faces, so full of life and innocence, and I realized something. This wasn't just about me anymore. If I held on to the past, if I let it consume me, I would be doing them a disservice. They needed a father who was present, who could model strength and resilience. And as much as I hated to admit it, they needed their mother, too. I took a deep breath and stood, the file still in my hands. I walked to the trash can and hesitated, for a moment before dropping it in. Closure on my terms later that day, I called Sarah. She sounded surprised to hear from me, her voice tentative. "Alex?" she said. "Is everything okay?" "I've been thinking," I began, my tone steady. "About what you said. About everything." She didn't respond, but I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. "I'm not sure I can forgive you," I admitted. "But I can't keep carrying this weight around either. It's not good for me, and it's not good for the kids." "I understand," she said softly. "I hope you're serious about changing," I continued. "Because they deserve better, and maybe, someday, I'll be able to see you as more than just this." Her voice cracked when she replied. "Thank you, Alex. I don't deserve your kindness, but I promise you I won't waste this chance." The road ahead. The weeks that followed, I focused on rebuilding my own life. I started therapy, something I had resisted for years, and began to unpack the pain and anger I had buried. Sarah made an effort, too. She showed up for the kids in ways she hadn't before, attending their school events, helping with homework, and just being present. We weren't friends, not yet, and maybe not ever, but we were co-parents, and for now, that was enough. As I watched my kids playing in the yard one afternoon, their laughter echoing through the air, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The past would always be a part of me, but it didn't have to define me. And as I stood there, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I could find peace. The evidence in the shadows, the house was still, bathed in the dim amber glow of the table lamp in my study. The silence pressed in around me as I sat there, staring at the old shoebox I'd found buried in the closet. It was unassuming. A box I had ignored for years, but I knew what it held. Inside were the remnants of a life I had thought I understood, a life I had built with Sarah brick by brick, only to discover the cracks beneath the surface when it was too late. I pulled off, the lid with a sharp inhale. Old receipts, screenshots of text messages, photos, all pieces of a puzzle I had pieced together 10 years ago. Back then, each discovery had been like a punch to the gut, leaving me gasping for air, questioning everything I thought I knew about her, about us. And now it felt like I was staring at someone else's pain. I sifted through the contents. With trembling hands, the memories coming back in waves. A dinner receipt from a restaurant we had never gone to together. A photo of her with a man whose face I had memorized like an enemy's. My fingers brushed over an email printout, and I froze. The final confirmation. The email was from her to him, dated nearly a decade ago. I can't stop thinking about you. Every time I'm with him, all I can think about is how much I wish it was you instead. The words hit me like a physical blow, my chest tightening as I read them again and again. I could almost hear her voice in the words, the same voice that had once whispered promises of love and forever to me. I slammed the box shut, my breathing ragged, my vision blurred, not with tears, but with a rage I hadn't felt in years. How? Dare she come back now, after all of this, and ask for a second chance? I leaned back in my chair, running a hand through my hair. The kids' laughter echoed faintly from their rooms upstairs, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. A confrontation in the dark that evening, Sarah came to pick up the kids for her scheduled weekend. She looked different, tired, hesitant. Gone was the confident woman I had once fallen in love with, replaced by someone who seemed unsure of her place in the world. As she stood in the doorway, I couldn't stop myself. "Can we talk?" Her eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. We sat in the living room, the tension thick between us. I placed the shoebox on the coffee table, the gesture deliberate. Her gaze flickered to it, and I saw the color drain from her face. "I found this today," I said, my voice low but steady. "I wasn't planning on going through it, but your visit stirred up things." She swallowed hard, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "Alex, No," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "I need to say this." I leaned forward, my elbows on my knees. "Do you have any idea what it was like, finding all of this? Do you know how it felt to question every single moment we shared, every memory, wondering if it was real or just a lie?" Her eyes glistened with tears, but I pressed on. "And now, after all this time, you show up, telling me you've changed, asking for another chance. Do you honestly think an apology can erase 10 years of betrayal?" Her response. She looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Alex. I don't even expect you to give me a chance. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try to make things right." I studied her, searching for some sign of the woman I had loved, the woman I had married. And for a brief moment I saw it, the vulnerability, the regret, the weight of her mistakes etched into her face. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," I admitted, my voice softer now. "But I do know one thing. The kids deserve better than this mess we've made. They deserve two parents who can put their pain aside for their sake." She nodded, her tears spilling over. "I'll do whatever it takes, Alex. Not for us, but for them. I owe them that much." The beginning of healing. As she left with the kids, I stood by the window, watching them drive away. The shoebox remained on the coffee table, its contents a reminder of a past I couldn't change. But for the first time in years, I felt a sliver of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It wasn't hope for reconciliation or even forgiveness. It was hope that maybe, just maybe, I could finally let go of the anger that had consumed me for so long. Because while the scars of betrayal would always remain, they didn't have to define me, the depths of regret. I stared at the email again. The words burned into my mind like a brand I couldn't erase. "I can't stop thinking about you." Her words. To him. It was as though I could feel the weight of every lie she had told me over the years, pressing down on my chest like an unbearable weight. And now, here she was, standing in front of me, asking for something I wasn't sure I had to give. I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in years. Sarah wasn't the same woman I had married, and she wasn't the same woman I had divorced. Her face was thinner, the lines around her eyes more pronounced. Her once vibrant energy had dimmed into something quieter, something broken. "Why now?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She flinched but didn't look away. "Because I couldn't live with it anymore. The guilt, it's been eating me alive, Alex." I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "Guilt? That's what brought you back. Not love, not the fact that we built a life together, but guilt." Her eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't stop. The floodgates had opened, and every emotion I had buried for years came rushing out. The crumbling facade due. "You know what it was like, Sarah? To look at you and wonder if you were thinking about him? To feel like I was never enough, no matter how hard I tried? And all the while you were smiling, lying, pretending everything was fine." She wiped at her eyes, her hands trembling. "I was a coward. I made mistakes that I can never take back, Alex. But I loved you. I still love you. I lost myself along the way." Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to believe her, wanted to find some shred of truth in her confession. But how could I? How could I trust anything she said when she had proven, time and time again, that her words meant nothing? "You don't get to say that," I said, my voice low but fierce. "You don't get to throw that word around like it fixes anything. Love isn't just words, Sarah, it's actions. It's loyalty. And you threw all of that away." She broke then, her sobs filling the room. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her it would be okay. But another part, the part that had been scarred by her betrayal, refused to move. A painful truth. "I didn't come here to make excuses," she said, her voice cracking. "I know I hurt you. I know I destroyed everything we had. But I had to try, Alex. For the kids, if nothing else." The mention of the kids was like a knife to my chest. They were the only thing that tied us together now, the only reason I hadn't. "Cut her out of my life completely. Do they know?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head quickly. "No, I'd never let them see that side of me." I nodded, relief and anger battling for dominance. "Good, because they don't deserve to carry the weight of your mistakes." She flinched again, and for a moment I thought she might leave, but she stayed. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes red and swollen. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said softly. I needed you to know that I'm sorry. Truly, deeply sorry. The road ahead, her words lingered, in the air long after she was gone. I sat in the empty living room staring at the shoebox on the table. Forgiveness wasn't something I could offer. Not yet, maybe not ever. But as I sat there, I realized something important. Her apology wasn't about erasing the past. It was about acknowledging it, about taking responsibility for the pain she had caused. I didn't know what the future held for us, but I knew one thing. I wouldn't let her mistakes define me. I wouldn't let her betrayal dictate my happiness. Because, while she had broken my trust, she hadn't broken me, and for the first time in a long time I felt a spark of hope, not for reconciliation, but for healing. The path toward healing. I woke the next morning with a heavy weight on my chest, the remnants of last night's conversation still echoing in my mind. Sarah's tears, her confession, her apology. It all played like a broken record, turning in the background of my thoughts as I went through the motions of my day, but nothing felt the same. The house was quieter without her, a silence that felt like it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. I had been living here alone, for the most part, even when she was still in the house. We had grown distant, long before the divorce, long before I uncovered the truth of her betrayal. But this silence, it was different. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the absence of the life we had built together. And in that silence, I realized something. It was over. Not in the sense that I would forget about everything we had been through, or that I could simply erase the history of our relationship, but in the sense that I didn't need her anymore to feel whole. She had taken so much from me, but she hadn't taken my will to move forward. A journey alone. I started with small steps. The first thing I did was call a therapist. It felt strange, like I was admitting something to myself I hadn't wanted to face. But the truth was, I had never really dealt with the fallout of our marriage. I had tucked it all away, pushed it into a corner of my mind where it wouldn't affect my day-to-day life. But now it felt like the only way forward was through that pain. I needed to unpack it, piece by piece, without her there to distort it. I still had the shoebox, the one with the evidence, the one that held the years of hidden betrayal. I didn't know why I hadn't thrown it away. Maybe it was because, in a way, that box held all of my unresolved feelings. It was the last physical manifestation of what I had believed was the truth of our relationship. But I had to ask myself, was it worth holding on to? The kids. The hardest part, though, was the kids. They had no idea. They saw Sarah as their mother, the woman who cared for them, who played with them, who kissed them goodnight. To them, she was a hero, a perfect figure of love and protection. But I knew the truth. And I wondered, could I shield them from it? I knew that telling them the truth wasn't the right thing to do, at least, not yet. They were too young, too innocent to bear that weight. But the questions would come eventually, and when they did, I would have to answer them, honestly, but carefully. I had to navigate this new life, not just for myself, but for them. I didn't want my pain to taint their view of their mother, even if I felt betrayed. One afternoon, after a long day of work, I found myself sitting with them at the kitchen table, helping with homework. Their laughter, the light in their eyes, it was a balm for my soul. They were the only thing that truly made me feel whole, that reminded me of the good in this world. Breaking free weeks passed, and I found myself letting go of the anger. It wasn't easy, but I realized that carrying the weight of my past was keeping me chained to something that no longer served me. Every memory of Sarah, every betrayal, was like a ball and chain, holding me in place, keeping me from moving forward. I had tried for so many years to hold on to something that wasn't real. The life we had built together, our house, our family, was based on a lie. But the truth was that I had to let go. I had to free myself from the past, even if it meant confronting my fears, my anger, and my hurt. The therapist helped me understand that forgiveness wasn't about excusing the things she had done, but about releasing myself from the grip of those emotions. It wasn't about her. It was about me. It was about taking back control of my life, about being the man I was meant to be without the shadow of her betrayal hanging over me. I started small. I let go of the shoebox. I packed it away in a box at the back of the closet, and one day, I threw it away. And for the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. A future reclaimed. Months later, I found myself in a place I never thought I would reach. I was healing. The anger, the bitterness, it had faded into something quieter, more manageable. I was still angry, still hurt, but it no longer defined me. I could finally look at Sarah without the weight of betrayal, clouding my thoughts. I could see her, not as the woman who had shattered my trust, but as the mother of my children. She would always hold that role, no matter what had happened between us. But as for us, I realized that we were no longer the same people who had fallen in love all those years ago. We had both changed. I had changed. And that was okay. I didn't need to rebuild what we once had, because I had built something new. I had rebuilt myself. And for the first time in years, I was beginning to believe that maybe I deserved happiness again, a future reclaimed. It had been a while since I'd taken a true breath of fresh air. Life had slowly begun to recalibrate, each step away from the past pulling me closer to the man I wanted to be, rather than the one I had been. There was a sense of peace now that hadn't been there before, the kind that settled deep into the bones, quieting the noise that had rattled my thoughts for so long. The kids were growing, and I was growing alongside them. As they developed their personalities, their quirks, I couldn't help but feel like my own rebirth was mirroring their stages of growth. I wasn't just fathering them. I was becoming the version of myself that I had always wanted to be but had been too afraid to pursue. And while I never wanted my past with Sarah to become a scar that defined me forever, I couldn't ignore the fact that it had shaped me, shaped how I approached every moment, every decision, every interaction. The weight of the past. The first time I saw Sarah after we began to find some sense of normalcy was a jarring moment. The kids had invited her over for dinner, wanting to have some semblance of family despite everything. It was a small, simple gesture, one I hadn't expected, but one I found myself agreeing to. I wanted the children to see that even fractured relationships could have a trace of peace. She arrived in a loose sweater and jeans, her hair slightly pulled back, the same warm smile that had once enchanted me, now tinged with something unfamiliar, an uncertainty, a hesitation. I could see that she too had changed, and in that instant, I realized we would never return to the place we once were. There was no going back to that kind of naive love. Not now. Not after everything. She stood at the door, eyes on me for a moment longer than needed. I caught myself holding my breath, waiting for her to speak first. "Hey," she said quietly, almost as though unsure if she had the right to be here. "I brought some dessert." Her voice had the same softness, the familiar cadence that used to be a comfort to me, but now it only reminded me of the distance we had covered and how far we still had to go. "Thanks," I replied, keeping my tone neutral, even though a part of me was still struggling with the idea of welcoming her into our home, into this space that had been mine for so long. The dinner itself passed without incident. The kids were excited to see their mom, and they spent the evening recounting stories of school and friends. But beneath it all, I felt the weight of the past pressing against me, unspoken tension swirling in the corners of the room, reminding me that no amount of time or shared smiles could erase the betrayal. I couldn't shake the thought of how I had discovered the evidence of her infidelity all those years ago. The photos, the phone records, the late nights I had stayed up, piecing together fragments of a life I hadn't realized I wasn't living. I had been her husband in name only, a shadow of the man I thought I was. But that man wasn't me anymore. I wasn't angry with her in the same way. The anger had been replaced with something that, while still painful, was more rooted in grief. Grief for the loss of the life I had imagined, for the family I thought we were building together, healing one day at a time. Days turned into weeks, and the emotional distance between Sarah and me continued to widen. There were moments when we spoke with ease, almost like old friends. Nothing more, nothing less. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't genuine either. There was a formality to our interactions now, a politeness that had never existed before. The years we had spent entwined, emotionally, physically, had now faded into something distant. It wasn't a bad thing. Necessarily, it was simply the reality of our new lives, and for the first time, I could look at Sarah without that crushing weight of resentment. I had moved beyond it. I had processed the hurt, grieved the loss, and found space within myself to breathe. There were moments when I caught myself thinking of how things might have been different, but I quickly squashed those thoughts. What mattered now was the future. My future. New beginnings. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft golden light across the backyard, I found myself sitting in the quiet of the house. The kids were out with friends, and the silence felt almost too loud. I stood up and walked into the living room, where the remnants of our past were tucked away in the corners. Old photographs, gifts we had exchanged, things that no longer had meaning, except as memories. I ran my fingers over the surface of a photo album, its pages filled with snapshots of a life I had once thought would stretch on forever. But that life was gone now, faded into the past. And that was okay. I was learning to be okay with it, forging a new path. I was starting to take control of my own destiny again.